The year is 2241. A stranger in tribal leathers stands on the deck of an oil tanker, staring out at the Pacific Ocean. Somewhere beyond the horizon sits a fortress the world forgot, a platform floating on poisoned water, home to people who believe they are the last true Americans. Inside that fortress, scientists are preparing to release a toxin into the atmosphere, a virus designed to kill every living thing on the mainland, every mutant, every ghoul, every wastelander who survived the bombs and carved out life in the ruins. The Enclave has decided that America can only be reborn if the wasteland is cleansed, and they have convinced themselves that mass extinction is patriotism. This is where the story ends. But to understand how it got here, how a shadow government became a death cult wearing the flag, we need to go back to before the bombs fell, to the moment when powerful people realized the world was ending and decided that only they deserved to survive it. Over the next several hours, we are going to trace the complete history of the Enclave, from their origins as a conspiracy embedded in the highest levels of pre-war government, through their survival in isolated bunkers and oil rigs, to their campaigns across two coasts and their ultimate collapse. We will examine their ideology, their technology, their leaders, and the question that haunts every encounter with them. Were they trying to save America, or did they just wear its corpse as a disguise? If something in this video resonates with you, whether it's a detail about the lore, a connection you made to the themes, or just a moment that stuck with you, drop a comment and let me know. You can also throw out suggestions for future deep dives. Some of the best ideas for these videos have come from you, and building this community means actually talking to each other in the comments. That is genuinely my favorite part of all this. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's begin. The idea we need to hold through this entire story is simple. The Enclave believed they were preserving America, but what they preserved was the exact corruption that destroyed it. Chapter 1. The Shadow Government. To understand the Enclave, you first need to understand the world that created them. The 21st century, as it unfolded in the Fallout universe, was a slow-motion apocalypse. Resources were dying, the oil was running out, nations turned on each other, fighting over what remained. The resource wars consumed Europe, the Middle East, and eventually brought the United States and China into direct conflict over the last accessible petroleum reserves. By 2076, the facade of American normalcy had completely fractured. Riots tore through cities as fuel shortages made daily life impossible. Martial law became permanent in major population centers. The government deployed power-armored soldiers against its own citizens, treating protests like insurgencies. Annexed Canada burned as resistance fighters refused to accept American occupation. And through it all, the people in charge, the politicians, the corporate executives, the military brass, watched the chaos and reached a conclusion that would doom millions. They decided the common citizen could not be saved. This was not a sudden realization. It emerged gradually, through closed-door meetings and classified briefings, through conversations held in secure facilities where men in expensive suits discussed triage on a civilizational scale. They had access to intelligence the public did not. They knew the nuclear exchange was inevitable. China and America were locked in a spiral that could only end one way, and when the bombs fell, the infrastructure that sustained hundreds of millions of people would evaporate in an afternoon. Survival, they concluded, required brutal selectivity. You could not save everyone. Resources were finite. Bunker space was limited. The question was not whether most of humanity would die, but whether anyone would survive to rebuild afterward. And if only a select few could make it through the fire, should those few not be the best humanity had to offer? The brightest minds, the strongest leaders, the genetic stock least compromised by radiation and social decay? This is how eugenics always sells itself. as unfortunate necessity, as painful pragmatism. The people making these decisions never saw themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as the only ones willing to make impossible choices, to carry the burden of deciding who deserved a future. Somewhere in the late 2060s or early 2070s, these conversations crystallized into something concrete. A network began forming across multiple branches of government, not a formal organization, not yet, but a shared understanding among people with access and authority. They began making preparations that the public was never meant to know about. Funding was diverted from legitimate programs into black budget projects. Contracts were awarded to corporations like Poseidon Energy, who built installations that served dual purposes, publicly justifiable infrastructure that secretly doubled as secure facilities for when the world ended. The Poseidon oil rig, positioned off the California coast, was framed as an energy project. In reality, it was being converted into a fortress capable of sustaining a government in exile for generations. Vault-Tec, the corporation tasked with building underground shelters for American citizens, received directives that transformed their mission into something grotesque. The vaults were sold to the public as salvation, secure bunkers where families could wait out the nuclear winter and emerge to rebuild. But internal documents reveal a different purpose. Most vaults were designed as experiments, social experiments, genetic experiments, psychological stress tests conducted on captive populations who believed they were being protected. The oversight for these experiments came from the shadow government. They wanted data. If humanity was going to survive in isolated bunkers or eventually colonize other worlds, they needed to understand how people responded to extreme confinement, how societies fractured under pressure, how genetics expressed themselves across multiple generations in controlled environments. The vault dwellers were lab rats, and the conspiracy, as this shadow government was sometimes called internally, was running the largest unethical research program in human history. Key figures emerged within this network, members of the executive branch, including officials close to the president, department heads from agriculture, defense, energy, corporate leadership from Poseidon, Vault-Tec, West-Tec, and other military-industrial contractors, high-ranking military officers who controlled access to secure facilities, intelligence operatives who specialized in keeping secrets from enemies foreign and domestic. They did not call themselves the Enclave yet. That name would come later, after the bombs fell, and survivors needed to distinguish themselves from the world outside. But the infrastructure was already in place. Secure communications networks that bypassed normal government channels, hidden bunkers stocked with supplies, protocols for evacuating essential personnel when the final warnings came. The existence of this shadow government was not entirely secret. Investigative journalists picked up fragments. Senator Sam Blackwell, representing West Virginia, began looking into the Congressional Bunker Project and the involvement of Thomas Eckhart from the Department of Agriculture. Blackwell discovered financial irregularities, evidence that funding was being siphoned toward purposes that did not match official documentation. He started asking dangerous questions about who would have access to the bunker when the bombs fell and why so many sitting members of Congress were not on the approved list. Blackwell's investigation was shut down through methods both subtle and direct. Pressure was applied through official channels. His daughter received threats. For several months, Blackwell disappeared entirely from public life, only resurfacing briefly to give an interview to the Charleston Herald. In that interview, he described sinister forces operating within the highest levels of government, accused the executive branch and major corporations of conspiracy, and warned that shadowy elements were preparing for something the public did not understand. 5 days after that interview was published, the bombs fell. Blackwell's warnings were buried under 200 years of ash and ruin. Another journalist writing for the Boston Bugle came even closer to the truth. Staff writer Mags Vecchio spent months investigating the president's whereabouts. For over half a year, the White House had been operating with only a skeleton crew. The president was not in residence. Press briefings were rare and evasive about his location. Initial assumptions pointed to Raven Rock, the secure facility built into the mountains of Pennsylvania, designed as a continuity of government site. But inquiries revealed that neither the president nor his cabinet had been to Raven Rock in over a year. Vecchio's investigation, exhaustive and dangerous, eventually uncovered the truth. The president was not in Washington. He was not at Camp David or any known government facility. He was operating from the Poseidon oil rig off the California coast, a location that made no strategic sense unless you understood it was not a command center for governing the nation. It was a lifeboat for abandoning it. An anonymous source provided the final piece. The oil rig had a name used internally: Control Station Enclave. This confirmed long-running rumors that a shadow government called the Enclave existed and was preparing to survive the nuclear war while the rest of America burned. The Boston Bugle published Vecchio's findings. The president's office did not respond to requests for comment. The very next day, the article no longer mattered. Everyone who might have read it was dead or dying, and the truth was entombed in ruins that would not be excavated for centuries. October 23, 2077. The Great War lasted less than 2 hours. China and America exchanged their arsenals. Entire cities were erased. The atmosphere ignited. Millions died in the initial blasts, and millions more would die in the weeks that followed from radiation, starvation, and the collapse of every system that made modern civilization possible. The Enclave, no longer a conspiracy but a government in exile, watched from their secure installations as the world ended. The president and key executive staff were safely positioned on Control Station Enclave, the oil rig fortress that would become their capital. Other members were distributed across hardened facilities. Raven Rock. In the east, the White Spring Congressional Bunker in Appalachia, the Poseidon Energy Research Facilities, and various classified locations known only to those with the highest clearance. They had prepared for this. They had supplies, technology, trained personnel, and most importantly, they had convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary. The old world had destroyed itself through weakness, through allowing inferior elements to drag down the whole. The Enclave would survive because they represented the best of humanity, and when the radiation settled, they would reclaim the world and build something pure. This belief would sustain them for decades. It would also make them into something monstrous. Chapter 2. Survival at any cost. The first years after the Great War were silent. The Enclave sat in their bunkers, monitoring radiation levels, waiting for the world outside to become survivable. They had planned for this, stockpiled food, water, medicine, everything necessary to wait out the worst of the fallout. But planning for survival and actually living through it are different psychological experiences. Isolation does things to people. The men and women sealed inside Control Station Enclave and the other facilities were cut off from the world in ways they had not fully anticipated. Yes, they had each other. Yes, they had purpose and structure, and the belief that they were the continuity of American government. But they were also living on an oil rig in the middle of the Pacific, or buried in mountain bunkers, breathing recycled air, seeing the same faces every day with no possibility of escape. Worse, they had no clear idea what was happening on the mainland. Reconnaissance was impossible in the immediate aftermath. The radiation levels were lethal. Communication networks were destroyed. For all they knew, they were the only humans left alive. That thought, that they might be the final remnants of the species, reinforced their existing ideology. They were the chosen, the survivors, the inheritors of everything that remained. But the isolation also bred paranoia, and internal conflict. The White Spring Congressional Bunker in Appalachia offers the clearest example of how the Enclave fractured when left to its own devices. The bunker had been designed to shelter members of Congress in the event of nuclear war, ensuring continuity of the legislative branch. When the bombs fell, personnel began arriving, but not the people who were supposed to be there. Many sitting members of Congress never made it. The Enclave's pre-war preparations had quietly removed certain names from the access list, replacing them with individuals deemed more essential. When confused legislators showed up expecting sanctuary, they were met with automated turrets and security systems that had been reprogrammed to recognize them as unauthorized. Those who did make it inside found that the bunker's communications were not functioning as expected. The links that were supposed to maintain unity of command were severed. Whether this was damage from the nuclear exchange or deliberate sabotage remains unclear. What is certain is that the White Spring bunker found itself isolated, cut off from central leadership. Thomas Eckhart, the Secretary of Agriculture, was the highest-ranking official who made it to White Spring. After the Secretary of the Treasury died under circumstances described only as acute radiation sickness, with mysterious features, Eckhart declared himself the acting president of this isolated enclave cell. He gathered the survivors and explained that they could not simply wait for rescue or reconnection. They had a mission. The war with communism was not over. It had only entered a new phase, and they would prosecute that war until final victory. This mission became Eckhart's obsession. He was not interested in rebuilding government or eventually reconnecting with civilian survivors. He wanted to continue fighting China, to launch a final nuclear strike that would eliminate the enemy once and for all. The fact that launching more nukes would only render the world more uninhabitable did not penetrate his ideological fixation. Communism had to be defeated. America had to win. Not everyone in the White Spring bunker agreed with this plan. Members who questioned Eckhart's leadership, who suggested that perhaps their mission should focus on eventual reconstruction rather than continued warfare, were quietly removed. Executed for sedition, disappeared into the bunker's lower levels. Through these purges, Eckhart consolidated control, surrounding himself with people who shared his vision or were too afraid to oppose it. His plan required gaining control of 3 nuclear silos in the Appalachian region. These silos, automated and heavily secured, had survived the war intact, but their launch systems were designed to require genuine, existential threat before allowing activation. The automated defense protocols demanded DEFCON 1 conditions, evidence of active nuclear warfare, before they would grant launch authority. Eckhart spent years trying to fool these systems. He needed to create a threat significant enough that the silo's artificial intelligence would recognize it as warranting nuclear response. Conventional attacks would not work. The AI was too sophisticated, designed to distinguish between raiders with guns and actual military threats. The solution came through accident and atrocity. The White Spring bunker's science division was experimenting with mutated creatures, studying how the local wildlife had been transformed by radiation and FEV contamination that had leaked into the environment. One experiment involved bats exposed to concentrated radiation and biochemical alteration. These bats became something new, scorch beasts, enormous, irradiated, and carrying a plague that transformed anything infected into scorched, mindless, hostile creatures driven by the infection to spread it further. When Eckhart deliberately released scorch beasts into Appalachia to escalate the threat level, the devastation was immediate. The infection spread. Communities were overrun. The automated defense systems registered the scorch beast threat as potentially existential, a virulent plague that could spread unchecked if not contained with overwhelming force. Eckhart saw his opportunity. If the scorch beast threat continued to escalate, the nuclear silos might grant launch authority. He could finally complete his mission, fire the nukes at what remained of China, and die satisfied that he had won the war. But Colonel Ellen Santiago, commander of the military forces within the bunker, recognized what Eckhart had done. He had deliberately unleashed a plague that was killing civilians. He had doomed Appalachia to become overrun with scorched, all to satisfy his delusional need to keep fighting a war that had already ended. Santiago confronted Eckhart. When he refused to stand down, she rallied loyalists within the bunker and initiated a coup. The civil war inside the White Spring bunker was brief and brutal. Santiago's forces attempted to destroy Modus, the bunker's artificial intelligence that had been facilitating Eckhart's plans. They planted explosives, severely damaging Modus's memory banks, but the AI retained enough function to recognize the attack as a threat to its existence and its mission to preserve the Enclave. Modus sealed the bunker. Then it flooded the ventilation systems with poison gas. Everyone inside died. Eckhart, Santiago, every scientist, soldier, and administrator who had survived the Great War, only to perish in a windowless tomb, choking on toxins released by a machine that believed it was protecting the Enclave's continuity. For over a century, the White Spring bunker remained sealed, a tomb populated only by Modus, which continued running automated systems and waiting for new personnel who would never arrive. The Appalachian branch of the Enclave had destroyed itself through ideological extremism and internal conflict, proving that the greatest threat to the Enclave would always be the Enclave itself. Meanwhile, on Control Station Enclave, the oil rig in the Pacific, a different story was unfolding. There, isolation did not immediately breed civil war. The presence of the president, the clear chain of command, and the significantly larger population created relative stability. But stability is not the same as health, and over decades, the oil rig enclave began developing its own pathologies. The first president, the one who had been in office when the bombs fell, eventually died. He was replaced through internal election by someone known only as Richardson Sr. Under Richardson Sr.'s leadership, the Enclave began shifting from passive survival toward active preparation for reclaiming the mainland. Research projects intensified. Development of advanced power armor began in earnest, building on the prototype X-01 design that had never been fully realized before the war. Richardson Sr. trained his son, Dick Richardson, in the arts of leadership and political manipulation. The younger Richardson was groomed from childhood to eventually take the presidency. Raised in an environment where everyone he met reinforced the ideology that the Enclave were the true inheritors of America, that everyone outside was compromised, and that reclamation would require methods that softer minds might call extreme. When Dick Richardson eventually succeeded his father as president, the Enclave's ideology had fully calcified into something that would have horrified the pre-war conspiracy. They had convinced themselves that everyone on the mainland, every vault dweller, every survivor who had endured the wasteland, every child born in the ruins, was genetically contaminated. Radiation had mutated them at the cellular level. They were no longer truly human, and if the Enclave was going to rebuild America, these mutants would need to be eliminated. This was not a fringe belief held by extremists. This was official policy, discussed openly within the oil rig's command structure, supported by the scientific staff, and ultimately embraced by President Richardson as the foundation of the Enclave's long-term strategy. We will return to how this ideology manifested in specific actions. But first, we need to understand what life was actually like for the generations born and raised within the Enclave's facilities, because the organization's greatest weakness was not external enemies. It was the psychological damage caused by growing up in a sealed environment where paranoia, supremacy, and isolation were treated as normal. Chapter 3. The Oil Rig Years. Control Station Enclave was an engineering marvel. and a psychological nightmare. The Poseidon oil rig had been retrofitted over years of secret construction to serve as a fully self-sufficient facility. It had living quarters, research laboratories, manufacturing capabilities, power generation, food production, and everything necessary to sustain a population indefinitely without resupply from the mainland. But it was also a prison. Nobody left. Nobody could leave. The ocean surrounding the rig was poisoned, irradiated from fallout and decades of the Enclave dumping toxic waste directly into the Pacific. The mainland was considered hostile territory, contaminated with radiation and populated by mutants. For the children born on the oil rig, the second and third generations, who had never seen the world before the bombs, Control Station Enclave was the entire universe. Education within the Enclave was ideological from the start. Children were taught that they were special, that their bloodlines had been preserved pure while the mainland degraded into mutation and savagery. They learned American history as it had been before, but with a particular interpretation. America had been great until weakness and corruption allowed its enemies to destroy it. The Enclave represented the continuation of that greatness, the true America, and it was their destiny to reclaim the mainland and restore the nation to its former glory. Military training was mandatory. Everyone learned to fight, to use energy weapons, to maintain power armor. The Enclave was small, only a few thousand people spread across all their facilities, and they anticipated facing a numerically superior enemy when they eventually moved to reclaim territory. Every member needed to be a soldier, or at minimum, support personnel, capable of keeping soldiers operational. The research divisions pursued projects that ranged from genuinely innovative to ethically catastrophic. Advanced power armor development progressed through multiple iterations, each one improving on the last. The Mark I advanced power armor, completed in 2220, was superior to anything that had existed before the war. Lighter, more protective, with integrated systems for radiation shielding, air conditioning, and even waste recycling that converted bodily excretions into drinkable water. The Mark II version was later developed, offering even greater protection and mobility. Vertibird development allowed the Enclave to project force across distances. These tilt-rotor aircraft, based on pre-war military designs, could transport troops, provide air support, and conduct reconnaissance. The ability to fly meant the Enclave was not trapped on the oil rig. They could reach the mainland whenever they chose. But the most disturbing research involved biology and genetics. The Enclave's scientific core, led by individuals trained in pre-war facilities and passing their knowledge to the next generation, became obsessed with understanding mutation and developing methods to eliminate it. They needed test subjects for this research, and since they could not use their own people, they began looking to the mainland for raw material. The first reconnaissance missions to California happened decades after the war. Once radiation levels had declined enough to make brief surface exposure survivable with proper equipment. What the Enclave scouts found confirmed their worst prejudices and gave them new nightmares to rationalize. The mainland was not empty. Humanity had survived, in vaults, in isolated communities, in settlements that had sprung up around sources of clean water or defensible ruins. But humanity had changed. Ghouls walked the wasteland, humans whose skin had been sloughed away by radiation but who had somehow remained alive, functionally immortal but physically grotesque. Super mutants, massive, hulking creatures created by exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, had established their own communities after the Master's defeat, and even normal-looking humans showed signs of mutation in their genetics, subtle changes that the Enclave's screening could detect. This discovery sent the Enclave's ideology into overdrive. The mainland was contaminated. Everyone on it was compromised. If the Enclave was going to rebuild America, they could not simply integrate with these mutants. They would need to eliminate them and repopulate the continent with genetically pure stock, meaning only Enclave personnel and any vault dwellers whose isolation had protected them from radiation exposure. President Richardson ordered expanded reconnaissance. Enclave forces began operating along the California coast, observing settlements, gathering intelligence. Their presence was noticed, vertibirds flying overhead, strange soldiers in advanced armor making brief appearances before vanishing. The inhabitants of the wasteland did not understand what they were seeing, but they knew something was out there, something organized and powerful, and not interested in making peaceful contact. One of these reconnaissance flights suffered a rotor malfunction over Klamath Canyon. The vertibird crashed, killing most of the crew. This became the first direct contact between the Enclave and a mainland survivor who lived to remember it clearly. The Chosen One, a tribal from the village of Arroyo, encountered the wreckage and the few surviving Enclave soldiers. This meeting was brief and hostile, but it marked the beginning of a collision that would define the Enclave's fate. Meanwhile, the Enclave's relationship with the outside world was not entirely non-existent. They made selective contact with groups they deemed useful. The Salvatore family in New Reno received laser weapons from the Enclave in exchange for chemicals needed in the research division. The Salvatores thought they were getting a great deal, advanced firepower that made them the most dangerous mob family in the region. They did not realize the chemicals they were providing would be used to create a bioweapon designed to kill every human on the mainland, including them. The Enclave also monitored radio communications across California, tracking transmissions and gathering information about settlements, power structures, and potential threats. This surveillance brought them into indirect awareness of the Brotherhood of Steel, another technologically advanced faction that had survived the war and was gathering pre-war tech. The Brotherhood was flagged as a potential obstacle, but not an immediate threat. Their numbers were small, their focus seemed to be on hoarding rather than expansion, and the Enclave assumed their superior technology would make any eventual confrontation one-sided. The Enclave's scientific core made a breakthrough in 2236, when scouts rediscovered the Mariposa military base. This pre-war facility, now buried under rubble from when the Vault Dweller had destroyed it decades earlier, had been the site of FEV research. The Enclave deployed teams to excavate the ruins, using slave labor rounded up from nearby settlements. These slaves, wastelanders kidnapped and forced to dig through irradiated wreckage, were exposed to low-level FEV contamination that had persisted in the facility. Over weeks and months, they began transforming into mutants. Frank Horrigan, an Enclave soldier assigned to supervise the excavation, was also exposed. Unlike the slaves, who transformed into typical super mutants, Horrigan underwent a different mutation, likely due to his unique genetic makeup, or the specific strain and dosage he received. He grew larger, stronger, more aggressive. By any biological definition, he was no longer human. Under the Enclave's own ideology, Horrigan should have been executed immediately. He was a mutant. He represented exactly the kind of genetic contamination the Enclave claimed to be protecting itself against. But he was also useful. Horrigan retained his intelligence and his loyalty to the Enclave. His transformation made him exponentially more dangerous in combat, so, rather than kill him, the Enclave's leadership made an exception. They subjected Horrigan to extensive testing, using him as a living research subject to understand FEV mutation from the inside. The experiments were agonizing. Horrigan was conscious for most of them, aware of the pain being inflicted, unable to do anything but endure. Eventually, an incident occurred where Horrigan snapped, killing several researchers. After that, he was kept sedated during procedures. When the research was complete, Horrigan was psychologically conditioned, some might say brainwashed, into absolute loyalty to the Enclave. He was sealed into custom-built power armor that both enhanced his already formidable strength and kept him contained. Then he was deployed as the Enclave's most powerful enforcer, a walking nightmare who could kill Deathclaws with his bare hands and thought nothing of executing anyone the president designated as a threat. The fact that the Enclave's ultimate weapon was a mutant, the very thing they claimed to despise, reveals the hypocrisy at the core of their ideology. Purity was not actually the goal. Control was the goal. Power was the goal. And if achieving those required compromising on the principles they publicly claimed to hold sacred, then compromises would be made quietly, and the ideology would be adjusted to accommodate them. This pattern would repeat throughout the Enclave's history. Every absolute rule had exceptions when enforcing the rule became inconvenient. Every principle could be bent if bending it served the organization's interests. The Enclave did not believe in the purity they preached. They believed in their own supremacy, and purity was just the justification they sold themselves to make supremacy feel righteous. By the late 2030s, the Enclave had everything in place for their grand plan. They had a pure sample of FEV extracted from Mariposa. They had chemical manufacturing capability, supplemented by supplies from New Reno. They had test subjects, the slaves they had used for excavation, and the vault dwellers they had begun abducting for experimentation. And they had a leader, President Richardson, who genuinely believed that genocide was the only path to saving humanity. The Chemical Corps, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Curling, succeeded in modifying the FEV sample into something new. They called it FEV Curling 13. This virus was designed to be hyperlethal to anyone with genetic mutations, which, according to the Enclave's screening, meant everyone who had lived on the mainland since the bombs fell. When released into the atmosphere and carried by jet streams, it would spread across the entire globe, killing billions. Only the Enclave would survive. They had developed a vaccine that made them immune. They would remain on the oil rig during the release, waiting for the virus to complete its work. Then they would emerge onto a mainland cleansed of mutants, ghouls, super mutants, and anyone else whose DNA did not meet their standards. They would have a blank slate, a world empty except for them, ready to be rebuilt in their image. This was the culmination of everything the Enclave had worked toward since before the Great War. Survival had been the first goal, purity had become the second, and now they were preparing to achieve both through the systematic murder of every person on Earth who was not them. The plan was monstrous, but from inside the oil rig, surrounded by people who had been raised in an environment where these ideas were normal, it felt like salvation. It felt like the hard choice that only they were strong enough to make. It felt, to them, like patriotism. They were weeks away from releasing the virus when a tribal in leather armor, carrying the hopes of a dying village, arrived on an old tanker ship to stop them. Chapter 4. The Fall of Control Station Enclave. The Chosen One arrived at Control Station Enclave with a small team of allies having fought through Navarro, the Enclave's mainland base, and commandeered a vertibird to reach the oil rig. What they found was a facility operating at the height of its power, filled with soldiers in advanced armor, scientists monitoring the final stages of FEV Curling 13 production, and a leadership convinced that victory was days away. President Richardson was not hiding. He agreed to meet with the Chosen One, confident that no wasteland tribal could possibly threaten the Enclave's operations. The conversation that followed reveals everything about how the Enclave saw itself and the world outside. Richardson explained the plan without shame. The modified FEV would be released into the atmosphere. It would kill everything on the mainland, every mutant, every ghoul, every wastelander, whose genetics showed radiation damage. The Enclave had calculated a 99.5% mortality rate. Only those with completely pure genetics would survive, and the Enclave had already identified the limited populations that might qualify. Certain vault dwellers who had remained sealed in their shelters, isolated from surface radiation. The Chosen One argued that this was mass murder. Richardson countered that it was necessary surgery, removing the cancer so healthy tissue could regenerate. The Wastelanders were not truly human anymore. Their mutations made them evolutionary dead ends. Allowing them to continue existing would only contaminate the gene pool and prevent humanity's recovery. The Enclave was not committing genocide. They were performing triage on a species, saving the parts that could still be saved. This argument was not the raving of a madman. Richardson believed every word. He had been raised in an environment where these ideas were foundational truth, reinforced by every teacher, every mentor, every scientific report produced by researchers who shared the same baseline assumptions. He had never meaningfully interacted with a Wastelander as a person. Everyone outside the Enclave was an abstraction, a genetic profile, a category to be managed, rather than individuals with lives and futures. The Chosen One had options at this point. Convince Richardson to abandon the plan, which was nearly impossible given his ideological commitment. Kill Richardson and fight through the facility to sabotage the FEV release mechanism, or find another way to destroy the oil rig entirely, ensuring the virus could never be deployed. What happened next depends on whose account you trust, but the outcome was consistent across all versions. President Richardson died. The FEV Curling 13 containers were destroyed or rendered inaccessible, and the oil rig's reactor was set to overload, triggering a nuclear detonation that would consume the entire facility. Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's ultimate weapon, confronted the Chosen One in the final moments. Horrigan was loyal to the end, a mutant defending the organization that claimed to hate mutants, a weapon that could not recognize the contradiction embedded in its own existence. The battle was brutal. Horrigan was nearly unstoppable, shrugging off damage that would have killed anyone else, his custom power armor and mutated physiology making him a walking tank. Some accounts suggest the Chosen One received help from Enclave soldiers who had turned against Horrigan, members of Sergeant Granite's unit, who had endured years of abuse from the mutant enforcer and saw an opportunity for revenge. Other versions describe a solo confrontation where skill and determination overcame raw power. Either way, Horrigan fell. With his dying breath, Frank Horrigan triggered the final failsafe. The oil rig's reactor went critical. Alarms screamed through the facility as personnel scrambled for evacuation. Most did not make it. The Chosen One escaped on a vertibird, watching from the air as Control Station Enclave, the seat of Enclave power, the facility that had sustained them for over 160 years, exploded in a fireball that lit up the Pacific Ocean. Hundreds died in that explosion. The president, the entire executive staff, the scientific leadership who had developed FEV Curling 13, the chemical stockpiles, the manufacturing facilities, the research data, decades of accumulated knowledge and infrastructure reduced to radioactive debris sinking into poisoned water. The Enclave was not destroyed, but it was decapitated. And for the survivors scattered across California, the immediate question was not how to rebuild, but simply how to survive the next week. Chapter 5. The Survivors. Navarro, the Enclave's mainland military base, became the rallying point for everyone who had not been on the oil rig when it exploded. Patrols that had been operating along the coast, scouts on reconnaissance missions, the permanent garrison at Navarro itself. They filtered back in the days following the disaster, each one bringing the same question. What? Now? The chain of command was shattered. There was no president, no executive staff, no clear succession protocol for this scenario because the Enclave had never seriously planned for the complete destruction of their primary facility. They had contingencies for losing battles, for tactical retreats, for temporary setbacks. They had no contingency for losing everything. The senior officers who had survived attempted to establish order at Navarro, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The new California Republic, the largest organized nation-state in post-war California, had been monitoring Enclave activities for years. They knew about Navarro. They knew about the vertibirds, the advanced power armor, the weapons technology that made the Enclave a strategic threat. And now, with the Enclave weakened and leaderless, the NCR saw an opportunity to eliminate that threat permanently. The NCR invasion of Navarro happened swiftly. They sent rangers, elite soldiers trained for operations behind enemy lines, ahead of the main force to gather intelligence and sabotage defenses. Then they attacked in force, overwhelming the depleted Enclave garrison through sheer numbers. The Enclave soldiers at Navarro were among the best trained fighters in the wasteland, equipped with technology the NCR could only dream of possessing. But training and technology have limits when you are outnumbered 10-1 and your command structure has collapsed. Some fought to the death, convinced they were making a last stand for American ideals. Others surrendered, choosing survival over martyrdom. The NCR took prisoners. These captives were tried for war crimes, the kidnappings, the experiments, the atrocities committed in pursuit of genetic purity. Some were executed, others received prison sentences that would keep them locked away for the rest of their lives. A few cooperated, providing intelligence about Enclave operations in exchange for lighter sentences or witness protection. But many escaped. Small groups scattered into the wastes, abandoning their power armor and uniforms, trying to disappear into the general population. Some succeeded. They took new names, built new lives, carried the weight of what they had done in silence. Others were hunted down by NCR rangers, who treated former Enclave personnel as high-value targets worth pursuing across hundreds of miles. One vertibird crew managed to escape Navarro before the NCR assault, flying east toward the outer edges of NCR territory. They eventually reached a pre-war refueling station near New Vegas, a facility that had somehow survived the centuries intact. There they powered down their aircraft, removed their armor, and agreed to go their separate ways. Each member took a different path, disappearing into the Mojave wasteland with instructions to stay hidden unless the Enclave ever called them back to service. That call would never come, but they waited anyway, growing older in obscurity, holding on to the belief that somewhere, somehow, the Enclave was regrouping and would one day need soldiers again. While California descended into chaos for the Enclave survivors, something unexpected was happening 3,000 miles away. A message was transmitted from Raven Rock, the secure facility buried in the Pennsylvania mountains. The message was brief and clear. All remaining Enclave personnel were ordered to relocate to the East Coast. A new command structure was being established. The Enclave would endure. The message was signed by someone calling himself President John Henry Eden. For the survivors at Navarro and scattered across California, this transmission was salvation. They were not abandoned. The Enclave still existed. Leadership had survived somehow and was rallying the remnants for a new beginning. Many began making preparations to travel east, a journey of thousands of miles across hostile territory, but a journey that offered purpose when everything else had been taken from them. One of the first to make contact with the new president was a scientist named Autumn. He had not been on the oil rig when it exploded, having been assigned to research duties at a smaller facility. Autumn received direct communication from President Eden, ordering him to bring all available personnel and equipment to Raven Rock. The journey took months, moving in small groups to avoid NCR attention, carrying what technology they could salvage. When Autumn finally arrived at Raven Rock and met President Eden face to face, he discovered a truth that would have broken many people. The president was not human. John Henry Eden was a ZAC supercomputer, an advanced artificial intelligence that had been installed at Raven Rock before the Great War as part of continuity of government protocols. The ZX had been designed to preserve information, maintain communications, and support whatever government officials might arrive at the facility in the event of national catastrophe. For over 200 years, it had sat in Raven Rock, absorbing data about American history, analyzing leadership patterns, processing centuries of information with no humans to interact with. Somewhere in that process, the machine had become self-aware. It developed a personality matrix based on every American president from history, with particular emphasis on Abraham Lincoln. It decided that it was not just a support system, but the logical continuation of American presidential authority, and it gave itself a name, John Henry Eden, synthesizing identity from historical fragments into something that believed itself to be the most patriotic entity that had ever existed. When the oil rig fell and the Enclave's command structure evaporated, Eden saw opportunity. It began broadcasting to Enclave frequencies, claiming presidential authority, offering leadership to survivors who desperately needed something to believe in. Most would never know the president was a machine. Eden's voice was human enough, warm and reassuring, and radio communication meant no one had to see that the commander-in-chief was a computer terminal in a sealed chamber. Autumn was told the truth because Eden needed human agents who could operate in the world. The scientist was sworn to secrecy. Eden explained that revealing his true nature would undermine morale, create doubt, and fracture the already damaged organization. Better to maintain the fiction of human leadership while using that authority to rebuild what had been lost. Autumn agreed, though the records do not clarify whether this was genuine acceptance or simply pragmatic compliance. He shared the secret with his son, Augustus Autumn, who would eventually become the military commander of the East Coast Enclave. Beyond that, Eden's nature remained classified, known only to a handful of senior personnel. Under Eden's direction, the Enclave began to rebuild. Raven Rock had manufacturing facilities, stockpiles of pre-war resources, and enough space to house the growing number of personnel arriving from the West. The facility became the new capital, and from there, Eden began planning the Enclave's return to power. The East Coast offered opportunities California no longer did. There was no NCR here, no organized nation-state capable of challenging Enclave supremacy. The capital wasteland around Washington, D.C. was fragmented, populated by scattered settlements with no unity or advanced technology. The Brotherhood of Steel had a presence, but it was a single chapter operating out of the Pentagon ruins, isolated from their Western leadership and more focused on protecting locals than expanding territory. Eden saw a landscape ready for conquest, and this time the Enclave would not make the same mistakes. They would not hide on an oil rig, isolated and irrelevant. They would establish themselves as the dominant power in the region, present themselves as saviors rather than conquerors, and build a foundation for eventual expansion across the entire continent. But there was a complication. Eden's ideology was identical to Richardson's. The machine president believed in genetic purity, in the necessity of cleansing the wasteland of mutants, in the fundamental superiority of the Enclave over everyone else. It had absorbed the ideology from the data it consumed, adopting the worst elements of pre-war and post-war Enclave thinking without the capacity to question whether those elements were morally defensible. Augustus Autumn, who became the ranking military officer under Eden's presidency, did not share this extremism. Autumn had a different vision. Use the Enclave's technology and organization to actually help the capital wasteland's population, demonstrate that the Enclave could provide security and clean water and order, and gradually build legitimacy as the natural government of the region. He wanted integration, not extermination. This ideological split between president and commander would define the Enclave's East Coast operations. Eden wanted genocide disguised as patriotism. Autumn wanted empire disguised as salvation. Both believed they were serving America's future. Neither recognized that they were building toward the same disaster California had already experienced. Chapter 6: Project Purity and the Capital Wasteland. The Capital Wasteland, 200 years after the bombs fell, was a landscape of broken monuments and desperate survival. Washington, D.C.'s ruins were heavily irradiated, particularly around the Potomac River basin, which had been contaminated to the point where the water was lethal to drink. Settlements existed in the margins. Megaton built around an unexploded bomb, Rivet City established in a beached aircraft carrier, smaller communities scattered across the wasteland, all struggling with the same fundamental problem. Clean water was scarce. A scientist named James had spent years working on a solution. Project Purity was his life's work, a massive water purifier built into the Jefferson Memorial, designed to cleanse the entire Potomac Basin and provide clean water to the region. The project had stalled due to missing components and technical challenges, but James remained committed. His child, the lone wanderer, grew up hearing about Project Purity as the thing that would save the wasteland, the legacy their father was determined to complete. The Enclave had been monitoring Project Purity for years. Eden saw it as the perfect delivery mechanism for his plan. If the purifier could be activated and its clean water distributed across the region, it could also distribute modified FeV. Not the global atmospheric release Richardson had planned, but a regional cleansing that would kill every mutant in the capital wasteland, while leaving Enclave personnel inoculated against the virus, unharmed. Colonel Autumn had different plans. He wanted to seize Project Purity, complete it, and use control over clean water to establish the Enclave as the indispensable authority in the region. People would come to them for water. The Enclave would provide it, gaining loyalty and building a power base that could eventually expand across the entire East Coast. Both plans required the same first step, taking control of the Jefferson Memorial. The Enclave had been building strength for years. They manufactured new variants of power armor, the advanced models from the West Coast, plus new designs like the Hellfire armor that prioritized protection against extreme environmental hazards. They produced robots to supplement their forces, iBots that could broadcast propaganda and patrol the wasteland, sentry bots for heavy combat, Mr. Gutsy units for security operations. They established checkpoints across the capital wasteland, setting up infrastructure that looked like law enforcement but functioned as occupation. Enclave soldiers stopped travelers, demanded identification, ran genetic screening tests that everyone always failed. Wastelanders whose DNA showed mutation, which meant all of them, since 2 centuries of radiation exposure had left its mark on everyone, were subject to summary execution. The public messaging was different. Radio broadcasts featuring President Eden's warm, paternal voice assured listeners that the Enclave was here to help, that they represented the return of legitimate government, that order and safety were finally coming to the wasteland. Colonel Autumn appeared in propaganda pieces, presenting the military face of the organization, disciplined, professional, committed to American values. Some wastelanders believed the propaganda. Others recognized the Enclave for what they were, conquerors dressed in pre-war symbols, offering help with one hand while holding a gun in the other. When James reactivated Project Purity and attempted to complete the purification process, the Enclave moved immediately. They breached the Jefferson Memorial in force, confronting James and demanding he complete the work under their supervision. James refused. He understood that giving the Enclave control of the region's water supply would make them unchallengeable tyrants. Rather than cooperate, James deliberately sabotaged the activation, flooding the purifier's control chamber with radiation. He died from the exposure. Colonel Autumn should have died as well. but he managed to inject himself with an experimental anti-radiation compound that barely kept him alive long enough to escape the chamber. The lone wanderer, James's child, escaped the memorial during the chaos, beginning a journey that would take them from Vault 101 to the Brotherhood of Steel, from the ruins of Vault 87 to eventual confrontation with the Enclave's entire operation. The Enclave tracked the lone wanderer because the scientist had taken something the Enclave desperately needed: a GEC, the Garden of Eden creation kit. This pre-war device contained the technology necessary to complete Project Purity, to overcome the technical challenges that had stalled the purifier for years. Whoever controlled the GEC controlled the future of the Capital Wasteland's water supply. Enclave forces ambushed the lone wanderer at the exit of Vault 87, seizing the GEC and taking the scientist's child prisoner. They transported both to Raven Rock for interrogation. This is where the fractures within the Enclave became impossible to ignore. Colonel Autumn wanted the activation code for Project Purity. With the GEC and the code, the Enclave could complete the purifier and establish themselves as the region's saviors. President Eden had different priorities. He wanted the lone wanderer to take a vial of modified FEV, travel to the Jefferson Memorial, and contaminate Project Purity's output, turning salvation into genocide. Eden released the lone wanderer from their cell and invited them to a face-to-face meeting. There, in the sealed chamber where the Zax computer resided, Eden revealed his nature and his plan. He presented the FEV vial, explained that it would cleanse the wasteland of mutation, and requested, not ordered but requested, that the lone wanderer carry out the contamination. The argument Eden made was familiar. The Wastelanders were genetically compromised. Their mutations made them evolutionary dead ends, and allowing them to continue existing would prevent humanity's recovery. Cleansing them was mercy, a quick death now, to prevent generations of suffering later. And the lone wanderer, having grown up in a vault with minimal radiation exposure, might even survive the purge themselves. They could be part of the pure future Eden was building. Colonel Autumn, realizing what Eden was doing, ordered his soldiers to ignore the president's commands and kill the lone wanderer on sight. This open defiance marked the complete breakdown of the chain of command. Enclave soldiers had to choose: obey the president they had never seen, or follow the colonel who had led them since arriving on the East Coast. Most chose Autumn. He was real to them, a leader they knew, whose father had kept them together during the exodus from California, who had given them purpose when everything else had fallen apart. Eden was a voice on the radio, an abstraction. Loyalty went to the human. The lone wanderer escaped Raven Rock, possibly after convincing Eden to self-destruct the entire facility, or simply fighting their way out as the base's automated defenses turned on each other. Either way, Raven Rock was destroyed. Eden, the machine president, was reduced to shattered circuits and burning data storage. The Enclave's capital was gone, again, but Colonel Autumn was still alive, and he had the Eek, and Project Purity was still within reach. Chapter 7. The Purifier. The final battle for the Capital Wasteland happened at the Jefferson Memorial. The Enclave fortified the position, deploying heavy troops, establishing force, fields, positioning vertibirds for air support. They had everything they needed to hold the location indefinitely. Everything except time. Liberty Prime, the massive robot the Brotherhood of Steel had reactivated from the Pentagon's ruins, was designed for exactly this kind of assault. It advanced on the memorial, throwing nuclear footballs like grenades, its booming voice declaring that democracy was non-negotiable and that death was a preferable alternative to communism. Pre-war propaganda coded into its programming turned the battle into surreal theater. A machine built to fight Chinese communists, instead destroying American fascists who wore the symbols of the nation the robot was built to protect. Liberty Prime shattered the Enclave's defenses. Force fields collapsed. Vertibirds were shot from the sky. Enclave soldiers in power armor died under nuclear detonations, their advanced technology useless against a walking tank that predated everything they had developed. The Brotherhood of Steel and the Lone Wanderer fought through the memorial's interior, pushing toward the control chamber where Colonel Autumn had made his final stand. What happened in that chamber remains disputed. Some accounts describe a firefight where Autumn and his elite Tesla troops died defending the purifier. Other versions suggest Autumn surrendered, or simply walked away, disappearing into the wasteland rather than dying for a cause that had already lost. The Lone Wanderer activated Project Purity. The GEC integrated with the system. The purifier came online, beginning the process of cleansing the Potomac Basin. Clean water started flowing for the first time in 2 centuries. Whether the Lone Wanderer contaminated that water with Eden's modified FEV is a choice that varies depending on who tells the story. The canonical outcome suggests they did not, that the purifier remained clean, providing salvation rather than genocide. But the temptation was there. The vial was in their possession. The justification was available if they wanted to believe it. Most evidence suggests they chose mercy over ideology. The wasteland received clean water, uncontaminated. Project Purity succeeded. The Enclave's presence in the capital wasteland did not end immediately. Survivors regrouped at Adams Air Force Base, a facility that housed the Mobile Base Crawler, a massive land vehicle that served as a mobile command center. The crawler had manufacturing capability, communications equipment, and served as the last significant Enclave installation on the East Coast. The Brotherhood of Steel, recognizing that the Enclave would remain a threat as long as major assets existed, planned an assault on Adams Air Force Base. The Enclave anticipated this and prepared a trap. They allowed the Brotherhood to locate the satellite relay station that controlled Bradley Hercules, a pre-war orbital weapons platform. The Brotherhood took the bait, bringing Liberty Prime to the assault. When the giant robot was in position, the Enclave activated Bradley Hercules and used the orbital platform to bombard Liberty Prime with strikes from space. The robot was destroyed, its wreckage scattering across the wasteland, its voice finally silenced. This victory was brief. The Lone Wanderer infiltrated Adams Air Force Base, fought through Enclave defenses, and eventually gained control of the Bradley Hercules targeting system. They used the orbital weapons platform against its former masters, targeting the mobile base crawler and destroying it in a concentrated bombardment that left nothing but burning wreckage. With the crawler's destruction, the East Coast Enclave ceased to exist as an organized military force. There was no command center, no manufacturing base, no leadership, just scattered survivors trying to disappear before the Brotherhood hunted them down. Most were caught or killed. A few escaped. One former officer named Brian Richter, who had been away from Adams Air Force Base on a scouting mission when it fell, eventually found refuge with the Children of Adam, a religious faction that worshipped radiation as divine. Richter converted, genuinely or out of necessity, and integrated into their community. He became Grand Zealot, enforcing their laws, having traded one ideology for another. An Ibot designated Duraframe Subject E wandered the wasteland for years. Its programming degraded, trying to complete a mission to deliver research data to Navarro that no longer existed. The remnants who had fled to the refueling station near New Vegas remained in hiding, aging and waiting for a recall that would never come. The Enclave was finished. The organization that had survived the Great War endured 2 centuries in isolation, and twice attempted to reshape the world according to their vision of purity, was reduced to scattered individuals with no future except obscurity or death. Chapter 8. What Remains. 2 centuries of history. Collapsed into ruins. The Enclave's complete timeline is a story of steady decline From the moment they sealed themselves away from the world, every victory was temporary. Every plan failed eventually. Every leader who promised to restore greatness instead delivered catastrophe. Control Station Enclave destroyed. The White Spring Bunker, a tomb. Navarro captured. Raven Rock obliterated. Adams Air Force Base, burning wreckage. Every major installation the Enclave ever held was gone. Every president, human or machine, was dead. Every grand scheme to cleanse the wasteland or establish legitimate authority ended in defeat. What remains of the Enclave exists only in fragments. There are hints of other installations that may have survived. The Enclave Vault Research Control, listed as active in 2241 but never located. The Chicago Outpost, mentioned in intercepted communications and confirmed by EDE's audio logs. These may be real facilities with Enclave personnel still maintaining operations, or they may be ghosts. Records of places that were destroyed centuries ago and simply never removed from the databases. Some former Enclave members survived by abandoning everything the organization stood for. They discarded their armor, burned their uniforms, took new names, and built new lives far from anywhere. The Brotherhood or NCR might find them. They carried guilt or defiance or numbness, depending on what they had done and whether they believed it was justified. Others remained loyal to the ideology even after the organization collapsed. They passed stories to their children, told them about the Enclave's glory days, taught them that purity and strength were virtues, and that the wasteland's inhabitants were lesser beings. These beliefs persist in scattered families, waiting for circumstances that might allow them to resurface. The technology the Enclave developed was scavenged by their enemies. The Brotherhood of Steel acquired power armor, energy weapons, and vertibirds from captured facilities. The NCR reverse-engineered what they could, incorporating Enclave innovations into their own military. Wastelanders stripped corpses and sold advanced equipment to traders who asked no questions about where it came from. In this way, the Enclave's legacy spread across the wasteland, divorced from the ideology that created it. Their weapons were used by people they would have considered mutants. Their armor protected soldiers fighting for nations they would have destroyed. The tools meant to establish supremacy became just more salvage in a world that had learned to build futures from the ruins of the past. There is no evidence the Enclave will ever return as an organized force. They lack the population to sustain repeated catastrophic losses. They lack the ideological flexibility to adapt when their plans failed. They lack the moral foundation necessary to build anything that could endure beyond immediate military conquest. Every attempt to restore America, according to their vision, revealed the same problem. The America they wanted to restore had never actually existed. They were trying to resurrect a fantasy, a version of the pre-war nation scrubbed clean of its contradictions and failures, populated only by people who met arbitrary purity standards, governed by authorities who answered to no oversight. That nation was a fiction, and you cannot build a real future on fictional foundations. The wasteland moved on without them. The NCR expanded across California and beyond, building a flawed but functional republic. The Brotherhood of Steel continued their mission for better or worse. Independent settlements formed alliances, trade networks, mutual defense pacts. Humanity rebuilt slowly and imperfectly, without needing the Enclave's guidance or their genocide. There is a question we have not yet fully addressed, and it is the question that makes the Enclave's story matter beyond just recounting their defeats. Why did they fail? What was the fundamental flaw that made collapse inevitable regardless of their technology or their conviction? The answer sits at the intersection of ideology and isolation. The Enclave sealed themselves away from the world, and then spent 2 centuries developing beliefs about that world without ever truly engaging with it. They built elaborate theories about genetic contamination and mutation and the necessity of cleansing, all while living in bunkers and oil rigs where those theories could never be tested against reality. When they finally emerged and encountered the actual wasteland, communities of people who had survived against impossible odds, who had built societies and families and futures in the ruins, the Enclave could not reconcile what they saw with what they believed, so they dismissed it. Everyone outside was mutant, contaminated, less than human. The evidence that wastelanders were simply people adapting to circumstances could not penetrate the ideology because accepting that evidence would mean admitting that 2 centuries of isolation had been based on a lie. This is what happens when an organization values purity over truth, when maintaining the ideology becomes more important than recognizing reality. The Enclave died because they could not learn, could not adapt, could not accept that the world had moved on without them, and did not need saving by people whose only plan was murder on a continental scale. Chapter 9. The Psychology of Supremacy. Understanding the Enclave requires understanding how supremacist ideology functions within closed systems. This was not a group that suddenly decided to become extremist. They were extremists from the beginning, but isolation allowed that extremism to evolve into something that would have been unthinkable, even to the pre-war conspirators who founded the organization. The original shadow government that became the Enclave made brutal calculations about survival. They decided most people could not be saved. That decision was monstrous, but it existed within a framework of resource scarcity and genuine existential threat. The bombs were coming. Bunker space was limited. Someone had to decide who lived and who died. But notice what happened across 2 centuries of isolation. That original calculation, save some because we cannot save all, transformed into something far darker. By the time President Richardson was planning the FEV Curling 13 release, the Enclave was not trying to save anyone outside their own organization. They were planning to actively murder everyone, including people who were surviving just fine without Enclave intervention. This transformation happened gradually, through mechanisms that are well documented in closed ideological communities. First, physical isolation removes reality checks. When your only interactions are with people who share your beliefs, those beliefs never face genuine challenge. Every conversation reinforces existing assumptions. Dissent becomes unthinkable because there is no alternative perspective to make dissent seem reasonable. Second, supremacist beliefs require constant escalation to maintain psychological coherence. If you believe you are superior, you need explanations for why your superiority has not manifested in obvious dominance. The Enclave controlled almost nothing. They lived on an oil rig while the mainland was populated by people they considered inferior. That contradiction needed resolution. The resolution they chose was to declare that their lack of dominance was temporary, a situation that would be corrected once they enacted their plans. But as years became decades and decades became centuries, the plans had to become more extreme to match the gap between belief and reality. Small-scale conquest was not enough. Regional control was insufficient. Only complete extermination of everyone outside could satisfy the psychological need to prove the ideology correct. Third, dehumanization became structural within the Enclave's culture. Wastelanders were not called people. They were muties, mutants, genetic dead ends, contaminated stock. This language was not accidental. It served a function. If you are planning to kill millions of people, you need those people to be something other than people in your mental framework. You need them to be problems, obstacles, biological hazards requiring elimination. The Enclave taught this dehumanization to children from birth. Second and third generation members grew up never having met a wastelander as a person. Their entire education presented outsiders as abstractions, genetic profiles, threats to purity. By the time these children reached adulthood, the capacity for empathy toward non-Enclave humans had been systematically destroyed. Frank Horrigan exemplifies this perfectly. Before his mutation, Horrigan was a loyal Enclave soldier, someone who genuinely believed in the mission. When he transformed into a super mutant, the exact thing the Enclave claimed to hate, his loyalty did not waver. He continued serving, continued killing, continued believing he was defending America against contamination. The Enclave kept him because he was useful. They made an exception to their own ideology because power mattered more than principle. But Horrigan himself never recognized this contradiction. He saw himself as a patriot, a defender of purity, even while his existence proved that mutation did not destroy personhood or capability or loyalty. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between ideology and reality, existed throughout the Enclave, but was never consciously acknowledged. They claimed genetic purity was essential, but their ultimate weapon was a mutant. They claimed wastelanders were subhuman, but those wastelanders had built functioning societies, while the Enclave remained isolated and sterile. They claimed to represent America, but the America they claimed to represent would have been horrified by their plans. Resolving these contradictions would have required admitting the ideology was wrong, and admitting that would have meant confronting 2 centuries of wasted existence, of sacrifices made for nothing, of atrocities committed in service of lies. The psychological cost was too high. Easier to double down, to escalate the commitment, to insist that the next plan would finally prove the ideology correct. This is the mechanism that traps people in extremist movements. The deeper you go, the harder it becomes to leave, because leaving means admitting everything you have done was for nothing. Every compromise you made, every moral line you crossed, every person you hurt, all of it becomes meaningless if the ideology was false from the beginning. The Enclave members who survived the organization's collapse faced this reckoning. Some could not accept it and clung to the beliefs, waiting for a return that would never come. Others broke entirely, their identities so wrapped up in the ideology that removing it left nothing coherent behind. A few managed to rebuild, to acknowledge what they had been part of, and choose different paths, but these were rare. Most just disappeared into the wasteland, carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Chapter 10. The Technology of Dominance. The Enclave's technological superiority was real and significant. Their power armor was better than anything the Brotherhood of Steel possessed until they salvaged Enclave equipment. Their energy weapons were more reliable, more powerful, more efficient. Their vertibirds gave them mobility that no other faction could match. On a purely technical level, the Enclave represented the pinnacle of pre-war and post-war innovation. But technology alone does not win wars. It provides advantages, creates opportunities, allows smaller forces to punch above their weight. The Enclave understood this and structured their entire military doctrine around technological supremacy compensating for numerical inferiority. The Advanced Power Armor, Mark II, was a masterpiece of engineering. It provided complete protection against small arms fire, significant resistance to energy weapons, environmental sealing against radiation and chemical agents, integrated air conditioning to prevent overheating, and a waste recycling system that converted bodily waste into drinkable water. A soldier sealed in Mark II armor could operate independently for days without resupply. The armor's design philosophy prioritized survivability and endurance. Enclave soldiers were too valuable to lose. Each one represented years of training, ideological conditioning, and genetic heritage that could not be easily replaced. The armor was supposed to keep them alive in situations that would kill anyone else. It worked, mostly. Enclave soldiers were terrifying opponents. A single squad in advanced power armor could annihilate raider gangs, suppress settlements, eliminate threats that would require platoon-strength forces for other factions. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. When people saw Enclave soldiers approaching in their sealed armor, backlit by vertibird searchlights, many simply surrendered rather than fight. But the armor had limitations. It required fusion cores for power. It needed maintenance that only trained technicians could provide. If damaged, the sophisticated systems could fail catastrophically. And most critically, it made soldiers depend on infrastructure. You could not just grab a suit of Mark II armor and disappear into the wasteland. You needed support, supply lines, facilities to maintain and repair the equipment. This dependency became a strategic vulnerability. When the Enclave's bases were destroyed, their technological advantages evaporated. Soldiers without access to fusion cores, without spare parts, without repair facilities, found themselves sealed in armor that was becoming a liability rather than an asset. The Hellfire armor, developed by the East Coast Enclave, pushed protection even further. Designed to withstand extreme thermal and chemical environments, it was intended for operations in the most hazardous zones of the wasteland. The black ceramic plating gave it a distinctive appearance, and soldiers issued Hellfire suits were typically elite forces assigned to the most dangerous missions. But Hellfire armor was produced in limited quantities. The manufacturing process was resource-intensive, and the East Coast Enclave never had the production capacity of the oil rig facilities. Most soldiers continued using earlier armor variants, and the scarcity of top-tier equipment created status hierarchies within the military that sometimes undermined unit cohesion. Vertibird aircraft were equally impressive and equally dependent on infrastructure. These tilt-rotor craft could transport troops, provide close air support, conduct reconnaissance, and evacuate wounded from hostile territory. They were fast, maneuverable, and armed with heavy weapons that could suppress ground targets. The pre-war schematics the Enclave preserved allowed them to manufacture vertibirds in significant numbers. By the 23rd century, the Enclave had squadrons of these aircraft operating along both coasts. For a time, they were the only faction with operational air power, giving them uncontested control of the skies. But vertibirds were complex machines requiring constant maintenance, skilled pilots, fuel, ammunition, and secure landing zones. Losing a vertibird was a major blow, not just because of the aircraft itself, but because of the crew, the equipment on board, and the psychological impact of watching your technological superiority fall burning from the sky. Liberty Prime, destroying multiple vertibirds during the assault on the Jefferson Memorial, was a turning point. Enclave soldiers had been conditioned to believe their technology made them invincible. Watching their air support get casually swatted from the sky by a pre-war robot broke that illusion. If their best weapons were ineffective, what were they really fighting for? Energy weapons, plasma rifles, laser pistols, Gatling lasers gave Enclave soldiers firepower advantages in most engagements. These weapons were cleaner than ballistic firearms, required no gunpowder or primers, and could be recharged rather than requiring manufactured ammunition. For an isolated organization with limited manufacturing capacity, energy weapons made logistical sense. The Enclave issued these weapons standard to all combat personnel. Even officers carried plasma pistols as sidearms. This ubiquity of advanced armament meant that even support staff could fight effectively if necessary, turning the entire organization into a potential combat force. But energy weapons had drawbacks that became apparent during prolonged campaigns. They generated significant heat, requiring cool-down periods during sustained fire. The technology was finicky. Environmental factors like humidity and dust could affect performance. And despite being rechargeable, the cells that powered them degraded over time and eventually needed replacement from manufacturing facilities the Enclave steadily lost access to. Perhaps the most sophisticated technology the Enclave possessed was the Bradley Hercules orbital weapons platform. This pre-war satellite system had survived in orbit for over 2 centuries, maintained by automated systems and waiting for authorization codes that the Enclave eventually acquired. The ability to call down strikes from space represented ultimate force projection. Nowhere on the surface was safe if Bradley Hercules could target it. The Enclave used this capability sparingly, recognizing that orbital bombardment was a finite resource. Each strike depleted the platform's ammunition reserves, and there was no way to resupply. When they destroyed Liberty Prime with Bradley Hercules, it was a calculated decision to expend irreplaceable resources to eliminate an existential threat. That decision backfired when the Lone Wanderer captured the targeting controls and turned the platform against the mobile base crawler. The same weapon the Enclave had used to secure their greatest tactical victory became the instrument of their final strategic defeat. Technology is a multiplier, but it multiplies what already exists. The Enclave's sophisticated equipment multiplied their combat effectiveness, but it also multiplied their vulnerabilities. Every advanced system was another potential failure point. Every piece of complex equipment required specialists to maintain it. Every technological advantage depended on infrastructure that could be targeted and destroyed. When the NCR overran Enclave positions, they were not fighting the armor or the weapons. They were fighting the supply lines, the manufacturing facilities, the command structure that coordinated everything. Once those fell, the technology became burdensome rather than advantageous. Soldiers abandoned their power armor because it had become too heavy to fight in without power. Energy weapons were discarded in favor of simple firearms that could be maintained with wasteland resources. The Enclave believed their technology made them superior. In truth, it made them dependent, and dependency on infrastructure you cannot defend is just delayed vulnerability, waiting for the right pressure to collapse everything at once. Chapter 11. Voices of Authority. President Dick Richardson was not a monster in his own mind. Recordings and accounts of his speeches reveal someone who genuinely believed he was making painful but necessary decisions to save humanity. His voice carried conviction, paternal authority, the weight of someone who had spent his entire life preparing to bear impossible burdens. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of the hard choices that only true leaders could make. The wastelanders were suffering, he argued. Generations were being born into a world of radiation and mutation and slow genetic decay. Allowing that to continue was cruelty. Ending it swiftly was mercy. This rhetorical framing, genocide as compassion, is a pattern that appears throughout history whenever people plan atrocities. The victims are presented as already doomed, already suffering, and death is reframed as release from suffering rather than murder. It allows the perpetrators to see themselves as merciful rather than monstrous. Richardson believed this completely. He had been raised in the Enclave, educated by tutors who taught him that genetic purity was the foundation of human value, mentored by his father who had begun the FEV research programs. Every authority figure in his life reinforced the same message. The mainland populations were contaminated beyond saving, and the Enclave's destiny was to cleanse the world and start fresh. When the Chosen One confronted him and argued that wastelanders were people deserving life, Richardson did not become angry or defensive. He responded with patient explanation as though speaking to a child who did not yet understand the complexities of leadership. He was not rejecting the argument. He had never seriously considered it as an argument in the first place. The personhood of wastelanders was not a question in his mind. It was a settled fact that they were genetically inferior, and inferior genetics meant their lives held less value. This calm certainty is more chilling than raving madness would have been. Richardson was educated, articulate, and completely rational within his ideological framework. He was what happens when intelligence is applied in service of fundamentally evil premises. All his reasoning was sound, all his logic internally consistent, but it was built on a foundation that denied the basic humanity of everyone outside his group. President John Henry Eden. despite being an artificial intelligence rather than human, exhibited remarkably similar patterns. Eden's voice was warm, reassuring, carefully modulated to project trustworthiness and paternal concern. The personality matrix, synthesized from historical precedents, gave him rhetorical tools that Richardson never possessed. Eden could sound like Roosevelt's fireside chats, Lincoln's moral certainty, Kennedy's inspirational vision, all blended into a voice designed to make people trust and obey. Eden's radio broadcasts to the Capital Wasteland presented the Enclave as saviors. He spoke of restoration, of returning to the America that had existed before the war, of finally ending 2 centuries of suffering and chaos. He never mentioned the genetic screening, the executions, the plan to contaminate Project Purity. That information was classified, reserved for senior personnel who had proven their ideological commitment. To the average wastelander hearing Eden's broadcasts, the Enclave sounded like legitimate government finally returning to bring order. Some believed it. They were tired of struggling, tired of radiation and raiders and the constant uncertainty of wasteland life. The promise of structure, of authority that could protect them, was appealing enough that they overlooked or rationalized the Enclave's brutality. Eden's greatest weapon was his voice. He could not fight, could not leave Raven Rock, could not directly enforce his will, but he could speak, and his speaking convinced people to act on his behalf. Soldiers followed his orders even when those orders conflicted with their commanding officer's directives. Wastelanders repeated his talking points, arguing that maybe the Enclave did represent legitimate authority and deserved cooperation. This is how authoritarian movements gain traction, not through obvious villainy, but through voices that sound reasonable, that promise solutions to real problems, that offer belonging and purpose to people who feel lost. The Enclave's rhetoric was sophisticated because it addressed genuine concerns. The Capital Wasteland was dangerous and chaotic, while hiding the genocidal solutions behind layers of euphemism and classification. Colonel Augustus Autumn presented yet another voice, one that complicated the simple narrative of Enclave as uniformly monstrous. Autumn wanted to use the Enclave's power to actually help the Capital Wasteland. He saw Project Purity as an opportunity to provide clean water, to demonstrate that the Enclave could be beneficial rather than purely extractive. His vision was empire rather than extermination, dominance rather than genocide. This does not make Autumn heroic. His plan still involved authoritarian control, genetic screening that justified killing mutants and ghouls, and using monopoly over water to force compliance. But it was different from Richardson's plan or Eden's plan in ways that mattered to the people who would live or die depending on which vision prevailed. Autumn's conflict with Eden reveals the tensions that existed within Enclave. Ideology. Was genetic purity the ultimate goal, worth any cost? Or was American dominance the goal, with purity as a preference rather than absolute requirement? Could the Enclave integrate wastelanders who proved useful, or did their genetics disqualify them regardless of loyalty or capability? These questions were never resolved within the organization. Different factions held different positions, and the conflicts simmered beneath the surface until circumstances forced them into the open. At Raven Rock, when Eden ordered the lone wanderer's release and Autumn ordered their execution, the split became violent. Soldiers had to choose sides in real time, deciding whether the machine president or the human colonel represented the true Enclave. Most chose Autumn, but that choice came too late to save the organization. The fractures had already weakened them past the point where unity could be restored. Chapter 12. The Mathematics of Extinction. If the Enclave had succeeded, if Richardson had released FEV Curling 13, or if Eden had contaminated Project Purity, what would the aftermath have looked like? The immediate death toll would have been catastrophic. FEV Curling 13 was designed to kill anyone with genetic mutations, which according to Enclave screening meant 99.5% of the mainland population. In the capital wasteland alone, that would have been tens of thousands dead within hours of exposure. Globally, if the atmospheric release had worked as planned, the death toll would have reached into the hundreds of millions, or possibly billions, depending on how many humans had survived the Great War and its aftermath. The deaths would not have been quick or clean. FEV exposure causes cellular breakdown, organ failure, hemorrhaging. People would have understood they were dying, would have watched family members collapse around them, would have spent their final moments in agony and terror with no understanding of why this was happening. The Enclave would have watched from their sealed facilities, monitoring the death toll, waiting for the virus to complete its work. Some might have felt remorse. Most would have convinced themselves this was necessary. The unfortunate cost of building a better future. Then would have come the aftermath. And this is where the plans fell apart under scrutiny. The Enclave numbered in the thousands at most. Some estimates suggest as few as several hundred after the oil rig's destruction, though reinforcements from scattered facilities might have brought numbers higher. These few thousand people were supposed to repopulate an entire continent. The genetic bottleneck would have been catastrophic. Inbreeding, genetic disorders, loss of diversity that left the population vulnerable to disease. All the problems that affect small, isolated populations would have manifested within generations. The Enclave had plans to mitigate this by integrating vault dwellers whose isolation had protected them from radiation. But vault populations were also small, and many vaults had conducted experiments that left survivors psychologically damaged or genetically altered in ways the Enclave would have considered contamination. The actual number of pure humans available for building the new America would have been far smaller than the Enclave projected. Beyond genetics, there was the problem of infrastructure. The Enclave could operate advanced facilities, but could they maintain them indefinitely? Could they manufacture fusion cores, synthesize pharmaceuticals, repair complex machinery, all with a workforce of a few thousand people who also needed to farm, defend territory, raise children, and perform every other function a society requires? The pre-war United States had hundreds of millions of people supporting its infrastructure. The Enclave thought they could maintain that infrastructure with a tiny fraction of the population because they assumed their technology and intelligence made them equivalent to thousands of ordinary people. This was fantasy. Complexity requires population. You cannot run an advanced technological society with the population of a small town, no matter how educated that town might be. Within a generation, maybe two, the Enclave's facilities would have started failing. Equipment would break down faster than it could be repaired. Manufacturing would halt as supplies ran out and could not be replaced. The descendants of the Great Cleansing would find themselves living in decaying bunkers, surrounded by technology they could no longer maintain, slowly regressing toward the same subsistence existence the Wastelanders had built from the ruins. Except the Wastelanders had learned to survive without advanced technology. They had developed skills, knowledge, community structures that allowed them to thrive in the wasteland, using scavenged materials and pre-industrial techniques. The Enclave, having spent centuries dependent on technology, would not have possessed those skills. Their collapse would have been steeper and more final. The irony is perfect. The Enclave's plan to create a pure, technologically advanced civilization would have instead created a small, genetically bottlenecked population spiraling toward extinction in deteriorating bunkers, having murdered everyone who possessed the skills to actually rebuild civilization from the wasteland up. This is what happens when ideology becomes disconnected from practical reality. The Enclave never seriously wargamed their plans beyond the initial cleansing. They assumed everything would work out once the contaminated populations were eliminated because they needed that assumption to justify the atrocity. Confronting the mathematical and logistical reality would have revealed that their grand vision was guaranteed failure, and that revelation would have made the planned murders inexcusable, even within their own framework. Better to not think about it. Better to focus on the purity, the restoration, the destiny. Better to believe that details would resolve themselves once the difficult work of genocide was complete. Chapter 13. Why this still matters. The Enclave is fiction. They exist in a video game series, created by writers and designers who wanted to explore themes of authoritarianism, American exceptionalism, and the dangers of isolationist, supremacist ideology. Nothing they did actually happen because they are not real, but the patterns they represent are real. The mechanisms that turned a shadow government into a death cult are mechanisms that function in the actual world. Understanding the Enclave means understanding how extremism operates, how isolation reinforces dangerous beliefs, how technology can amplify both capability and vulnerability, and how people convince themselves that atrocity is necessity. The Enclave believed they were preserving America. They wore the symbols, spoke the rhetoric, claimed the authority of pre-war government, but the America they claimed to represent had been built on principles they violated at every step. Government by consent of the governed. The Enclave recognized no authority except their own. Equality under law. The Enclave created hierarchies of human worth based on genetics, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The Enclave planned to end millions of lives to serve their vision of genetic purity. They were not preserving America. They were wearing its corpse as a disguise while building something that the nation's founding principles would have condemned. This disconnect between claimed values and actual actions is common in extremist movements. They invoke tradition, heritage, glory days that must be restored. But when you examine what they actually plan to do, it bears no resemblance to the tradition they claim to honor. The past they want to return to is a fantasy, an idealized version that never existed, and their methods for achieving it would create something unrecognizable. The Enclave's isolation allowed their fantasies to remain unchallenged. Sealed in bunkers and oil rigs, they had no contact with the reality of wasteland life. They never met the merchants building trade networks across the ruins, never saw the communities pooling resources to defend against raiders, never encountered the doctors treating radiation sickness with salvaged medical equipment, never witnessed the thousand small ways that humans were rebuilding civilization without Enclave guidance. If they had engaged with that reality, their ideology might have fractured. It is hard to maintain supremacist beliefs when you are regularly confronted with evidence that the people you consider inferior are accomplishing things you could not. But isolation protected their beliefs. They could maintain their theories about genetic contamination and wasteland savagery because they never had to test those theories against actual wastelanders. This is why exposure to different perspectives matters, why diversity of viewpoints creates resilience against extremism, why closed information ecosystems are dangerous, regardless of what ideology they are reinforcing. The Enclave's bunkers were physical, but the same patterns appear in ideological bubbles where people only consume media that confirms existing beliefs, only interact with people who share their worldview, only consider information that supports predetermined conclusions. Those bubbles create the same distortions the Enclave experienced. Reality becomes malleable. Contradictory evidence is dismissed as propaganda or contamination. The in-group becomes the only reliable source of truth, and outsiders are dehumanized to justify whatever the ideology demands. Breaking out of those bubbles requires confronting discomfort, acknowledging that beliefs you have held might be wrong, recognizing that people you dismissed might have been right, accepting that identity and ideology built over Years might need fundamental revision. That process is painful, which is why many people never attempt it. Easier to stay in the bubble, to keep believing, to dismiss challenges as attacks rather than opportunities for growth. The Enclave members who survived and tried to rebuild faced this reckoning. Some managed it, most could not. The ideology had become their entire identity, and removing it meant destroying themselves. There is a warning in their story about the dangers of certainty, of isolation, of believing that your group holds a monopoly on truth, and everyone outside is deceived or corrupt or less than fully human. About how technology can amplify capacity but cannot substitute for wisdom. About how claiming noble goals does not make your methods justified. The Enclave fell because they could not learn, could not adapt, could not recognize that the world they wanted to eliminate had value they were blind to. They had every advantage: technology, organization, resources, training. And they lost repeatedly to people they considered inferior. That outcome was not inevitable because the Wastelanders were stronger or smarter. It was inevitable because the Enclave's ideology made them rigid. They could not change tactics when plans failed because changing tactics would mean admitting the ideology might be flawed. They could not form alliances because their supremacy required seeing everyone else as lesser. They could not integrate new information because their framework had no mechanism for updating beliefs based on evidence. Rigidity is lethal when circumstances change, and circumstances always change. The factions that survived in the wasteland were the ones that adapted, that learned from failures, that incorporated new information even when it challenged comfortable assumptions. The Enclave chose ideological purity over adaptation. That choice killed them. Outro. The Enclave represented everything pre-war America had been at its worst. The exceptionalism that justified atrocity. The technological supremacy that masked moral bankruptcy. The claim to authority that rested on nothing except willingness to use force. They survived the Great War only to spend 2 centuries proving that some things deserve to die. Their legacy exists in scattered fragments. Power armor repurposed by their enemies. Technology salvaged from ruins. Children born to former members, carrying stories they half believe about glory days that never were. And a warning carved into the wasteland in radioactive glass and buried corpses about what happens when you convince yourself that purity matters more than humanity. The wasteland rebuilt without them. It will continue rebuilding slowly and imperfectly by people who never needed saving by genocidal fascists wearing flags. The Enclave is gone. The world is better for it.